Hi, I'm Katie with Modern Textiles, and today I'm going to teach you the top 3 methods of quilt binding. First off, I've just got a little test panel here of a quilt sandwich. So I've got a backing, the batting, and then a quilt top, if you will. I'm going to go ahead and attach my binding, which is just 2.5-inch strips pressed in half, and then that way I will attach the raw edge to the front of my quilt, and then I'll go ahead and show you the different variations on how to finish out your quilt onto the back of your quilt. First things first, I'm a big fan, I've got an analog quilting machine. So I know you guys have seen me using magnetic seam guide before, but I thought I'd just let you guys know there is some concern out there if you should use magnetic seam guides with your sewing machine. I do have an analog machine, so it doesn't have an issue with it, but I would definitely check your user manual for your quilting or for your sewing machine, just to make sure that it's going to play nice with your sewing machine. It's not going to mess anything up, because we know this is probably the most expensive tool that we do have in our sewing rooms. So I'm going to go ahead and set my magnetic seam guide to the 1/4 inch right on my plate. I like to use the magnetic seam guide because I'm not a big fan of swapping out my feet. So that just allows me the flexibility to move the seam guide as needed without having to swap out feet for my sewing machine. So we'll go ahead and attach my binding, and when I get to the joining of ends, I'll show you a quick tip on how to join those without any special tools or anything like that. All right, so I have my tail that I started with. Now I'm going to go ahead, I usually have a 2.5-inch strip around here, but I don't. So when I join my binding, you know the strips I cut for the binding are 2.5 inches wide. So I just go ahead and take that scrap edge and I line it up so you can see. It might be a little tough because it's black and black. So I've got my scrap edge. This is 2.5 inches wide. I'm going to layer it on top of my tail end I started with, so it lines up with that edge here. Flatten it out, so I've got 2.5 inches that I need for overlap. I'll lay this, and then just use my scissors, make sure I'm not snagging that original binding edge, and cut. So now I've got a 2.5-inch overlap. So I've opened the original tail, I'm laying that flat, right side up, and then, so you're going to want to bring your cut edge to this edge, okay, without twisting it. So we're here, we're going to take it, and then right sides together. And if you want to, you can go ahead and draw a diagonal line on your top binding there. I should pin this quick. So I always like to pin in the direction that I'm gonna sew, so that way I don't have to remove pins while I am sewing. All right, so you may need to fold your quilt top at this point just to get a little bit more slack in your binding, and then we will we'll sew from this edge down to that corner. As you can see, I've got some seam tape here. This is from Cluck Cluck Sew, her seam tape. I think it's available at Fat Quarter Shop. I'll make sure to link it in the show notes, the description there. I've got my seam sewn. I'm going to remove my needles, and I'm just going to double check. All right, we're sitting good, right? There's no twists. This is how I want it. To this day, I always double check that I have my seam right. There's plenty of times, even sometimes you just are in the moment and you're thinking about other things and you sew it and you're like, man, that was wrong. So make sure, just double check that it's proper and that it's snug, so that way it's not going to get all bunched up or have any type of puckers there. And now I'll go ahead and use my scissors and trim that, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right. And then I just like to finger press my seams off to one side. That's all I do. All right, and now it's going to lay flat. Go ahead, finish up attaching to the front of the quilt with that 1/4 inch seam. I'm gonna go ahead to my pressing station and I'm just gonna press my binding away from the seam we just sewed. That way when you're hand binding, it'll be easier to just fold it back and over. Okay, you don't need to go ahead and press. I'd say for the most part when I'm machine binding, I don't press away, but if I'm doing any type of hand binding, I go ahead and press it just to alleviate a little bit more tension, things like that, to make this a lot easier. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and show you, since we've pressed everything out, the main thing is when we are folding over our binding, I have my attachment seam. You can see I have two seams there. One was when I was just doing kind of a victory lap, that 1/8 inch seam there. And then I have a 1/4 inch seam of where we attach the binding on that inside one here. So the main thing is I'm gonna wanna make sure that I fold over and just barely cover that 1/4 inch seam from attaching the binding. And then I'm gonna go ahead and clip in place, clip in place, and then I'm gonna go ahead and just round this corner, just like we would when we're machine binding. So I'm just gonna use my stiletto to hold that 90-degree tight, and then I've got a nice miter edge. Just gonna make sure everything looks good, and then I'm gonna put my next clip into place. So I'm gonna do big stitch binding right here, and then I'm gonna do the invisible stitch here. So you can see I've got my 90-degree miter, and everything's looking great. So before we start, I'm gonna go over the tools that I'm using. I'm just grabbing, nice 125, DMC number 5 through 10 embroidery needles. I just have a nice big eye for my DMC floss. I'm using white in the size number 8. That's just, it's preference. I'd say anywhere from 8 to 12 is a good size. And then for my invisible stitch, I'm just using a black to go along with my binding. And it's a 50 weight, just poly thread that I have for on hand. I also have just regular thread snips, and then just make sure you have a thimble of your choice. I like these hard plastic ones. I kind of get a little aggressive when I'm stitching. So, all right, so first things first, we're gonna do this big stitch into the corner. So what I like to do, I've already threaded my needle. I'm gonna go ahead and just do a standard knot on the very tail end. And I like to leave not a very long tail, but nice knot there. And I go about 18 inches in length, maybe up to 36 inch, depending on how I'm feeling for the day. And I'm gonna start about, maybe 2 inches away from where my first stitch is gonna be. So 1.5 to 2 inches. And I'm just gonna catch right inside of that seam. So that 1/4 inch seam where we attached our binding. And then pull it through. There's my knot. And I'm just gonna tuck the tail of that up into my seam allowance. So that way it just stays hidden. If you want, you can always go ahead and trim that. But typically I'll start there, and then I'm gonna start with my big stitch binding coming up about, like I said, 1.5 to 2 inches away. I'm gonna go ahead and just catch the backing and a little bit of batting, and then I'm gonna pop up through to the front, or to my binding. And I'm just gonna move this clip here quick. And the big thing with big stitch binding is you're wanting to just make them as even as possible, as you're wanting this to kind of show. So maybe every 1/8 inch, every 1/4 inch. So once again, just trying to make sure you've got a nice even even stitch. And then some people do a nice little decorative stitch here in the corner, just because you can. So I'm gonna do a little X, making sure I'm not catching through to the front. And then coming back down. And this is where I'm gonna end my big stitch binding. So I'm just gonna pop through. So I'm making my X, but I'm gonna pop through and not catch the binding because I don't want it to show on this other side. So as you can see, I'm doing my last bit of the X. And maybe I could have made that X a little bit more clean. sure. Once again, it's all about practice. But with the big stitch binding, you're looking more for that, you know, visual contrast to give it a bit more personal touch. And I'm gonna go ahead and knot this off underneath. And from here, you can leave a tail if you'd like. I'm just gonna go trim it down. This little sample's just for demonstration purposes. So big stitch binding, there you have it. All right, so we're gonna show you the invisible stitch binding, which I've already thread my needle, and I've got a knot at the very end here. I'm gonna go ahead and just start catching right behind that 1/4 inch seam and catch the backing and the binding, or the backing and the batting. So I'm gonna go ahead and just catch the tail with a secondary knot just to really secure it into place. And that way I know that that tail's not going anywhere. This would be the time that I'd tuck that tail up into the seam allowance, just so I know it's gonna stay put. I don't need to trim it then. All right, so I got my starting thread right there in the corner, and I'm gonna go up into the binding because I'm already coming through the backing, the batting, and I'm just catching that very outer edge of the binding. And then I'm gonna go back down, kind of whip stitch it here. I'm gonna catch behind or right around that seam, that 1/4 inch seam, and go up through the backing, batting, and then back up through the binding. And about every 1/4 inch to 1/4 is kind of the goal here. You can't even see those invisible stitches. So you just keep going and then do a similar situation here at the mitered corner. More than likely you won't do this type of decorative stitch. So you've got your big stitch binding. Once again, practice makes perfect. And then you've got your invisible stitch binding. All right, so I've gone ahead and just placed my clips every 5 or so inches on my binding. Once again, covering that 1/4 inch seam from the front. And I've moved my seam gauge over to the 10 millimeter mark. That's just where I like it. So that way when I go ahead and stitch, I know I've got white thread here, and you'll be able to see how it looks on the back side, as well as it'll kind of stitch right in the ditch on the front there. So starting off, I'm gonna make sure that I am starting about a 1/4 inch where that 1/4 inch seam is for this back side here. I'm gonna put my needle down, bring it back up, and pull my bobbin thread up so that way it's a nice clean look on the front. And I'm gonna back up a little bit. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and start moving forward. I'm gonna dial my speed down because sometimes I go a little wild. So I just like to use a straight pin, and I'm going to lift my needle up. So essentially I'm pulling down the fabric, the binding. Let's just get this clipped right here. All right. Probably would have typically done this a little bit earlier, but I pull down and I keep the pin straight. And then that way, hopefully you can see that, my 2 bindings meet up perfectly at the edge. All right, so there you've got the nice perfect miter edge here, both on the front and the back. And then on the front, you can see our stitching. Oh, let's see. You can see our stitching right there. That's gonna be right, nice, kind of complementary. That's how I prefer my binding. In the next video, I'm gonna show you how to make half square triangles the 2 at a time method.